Our scripture is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and we have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and they paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. So Friday was the church holiday called the Feast of the Epiphany. And the definition of that word, epiphany, I'll read a definition here. An epiphany is a usually sudden manifestation or perception of the essential nature or meaning of something, or an intuitive grasp of reality through something like an event that is usually simple and striking. The word epiphany makes me think of high school English class. Anybody else remember that from high school? No. We learned the word in English class because it's a common literary device. So you read a story, you get to the end of the story, and one of the characters has an epiphany or a sudden realization about something that's happened to them. It's a Greek word, or it comes from the Greek, and I think probably its original meaning is in a religious or supernatural context. And it means the appearance or the manifestation of some sort of divine being. And we call Friday's holiday Epiphany. Actually, the whole weekend of January 6th and 8th is part of the Epiphany celebration. Friday, we celebrate when the visit of the Magi to the child Jesus. And this is when Jesus, who is the Messiah, the Son of God, is revealed to the Magi from these distant lands in the East. And then on Sunday, we recognize the baptism of Jesus. And that's when God reveals Jesus' identity, right? His voice comes down from heaven saying, "This is my Son, the beloved." And the dove comes down from heaven and lands on him. So these epiphanies are the revelation of Jesus to the Magi, and by extension, the revelation of Jesus to the Gentiles, including us, and also the epiphany of Jesus' identity as the Son of God at his baptism. So the story of the Magi, that's the Greek word, Magi, which is astrologers, wise men, sometimes they're interpreters of dreams, soothsayers, all of these things are contained in that word. Their visit to Bethlehem is one of the most well-known stories in the Gospel of Matthew. It only happens in Matthew. And especially in Christmas pageants, which I think we have enough kids at this point that we could maybe do that. And it's a very dramatic story. In the story, we see Herod trying to manipulate the Magi for his own purposes, so he can go find Jesus, and he wants to kill Jesus. Now, I know, switching gears a little bit, I know that we've talked about this before, but does anybody remember the term midrash? Can anybody give like a working definition? You were nodding.
So like the Jewish tradition where like rabbis and stuff just like throw around their ideas about scripture and what it means.
Exactly. Yeah. So midrash is it's a Hebrew word, and it basically means sort of it's a way of interpreting a text, or studying a text, or exegeting a scripture. And midrash derives from the word darash, and that means to seek something out, or to seek something with a lot of care, or to inquire of something. And so in the Jewish context, midrash refers to a way of studying the scriptures, where rabbis will read a story or a passage, and they'll kind of expand it and maybe fill in some details that aren't given, or ask questions about the text. And sometimes this will involve retelling a biblical story from one of the characters' viewpoints in the story. And I bring this up because there is a poem that I really love about the Magi's visit to Jesus. And the poem works as a kind of midrash on that story. And the poem was written by the poet T.S. Eliot. Anybody ever heard of him? I'm sure. So T.S. Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1888. And he eventually immigrated to England, and he lived there until he died in 1965. And he was one of the century's most important writers. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature, very famous poet. And also, interestingly, he had a profound religious experience, which led him to convert to Christianity. And the poem about the Magi that he wrote is called The Journey of the Magi, and it tells the story from the Magi's perspective. And so I want to read that poem right now. Just out of curiosity, has anybody read this before? Yeah, okay. This is The Journey of the Magi. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. And the camels, galled and sore-footed and refractory, lying down in the melting snow. There were times that we regretted our summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Then the camelmen cursing and grumbling and running away and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. At the end, we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. Then at dawn, we came down to a temperate valley, wet below the snow line, smelling of vegetation, with a running stream and a watermill beating the darkness, and 3 trees on the low sky. And an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Then we came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, 6 hands at an open door dicing for pieces of silver, and feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information. And so we continued and arrived at evening, not a moment too soon, finding the place. And it was, you might say, satisfactory. All this was a long time ago, I remember, and I would do it again. But set down this. Were we led all that way for birth or for death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence, and no doubt. I'd seen birth and death, but had thought that they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death. So what I appreciate about this poem is that it acknowledges the complicated nature of encountering Jesus, essentially. So the narrator acknowledges the real difficulty of this journey that the Magi take to go see this Messiah, who they don't know, but also the strange and actually kind of scandalous ordinariness of the Son of God when they go find him. And that it's kind of a funny detail that when they get to the house where Jesus is, they don't describe it as a purely joyful experience. The narrator says, it was satisfactory. It was okay, meh. The house was normal. The Messiah seemed to be just like a normal child, like any other. And this contrasts with other ancient birth stories about royal or important people who were born. So in those stories, infants sometimes have supernatural powers, or they can, or they're already able to speak. But here the Magi say it was satisfactory. He seemed like a normal person. And again, what I think makes this poem special is Eliot's willingness to talk about the complicated nature of encountering God and moving towards God, I guess. So I did a little bit of reading about this poem this week, and T.S. Eliot seems to have written it as a kind of description of his own spiritual journey. So supposedly, his colleagues and his acquaintances and his friends, they considered his conversion to Christianity as sort of a symptom of him wanting to settle down into adulthood, and to kind of reset to a status quo. And it seemed to signify sort of a kind of domestication of his life. But to him, his conversion was actually the complete opposite of that. It was not a way to make his life easier or more comfortable, or a way to cope with the difficulties of life. It was actually a very arduous experience, and it was an experience that never ended. He kept needing to engage it. And you can sort of see that in the way that his poem ends. With the Magi returning to their homelands, but when they get there, they feel like aliens. They're changed after it. They aren't comfortable in their old lives anymore. So they even sort of regret aspects of their old life. And they talk about the strenuousness and the demands of the journey that make them regret aspects of their old lives, the things that they used to value, like their palaces and their exotic foods and the women who used to wait on them. And so this birth that they experience when they come into contact with Jesus, they do actually experience it as a kind of death at the same time. The death of their old selves, the death of their old understandings. And I think many of us can probably relate to this feeling. That following Jesus, it is a kind of death in a way. It's a death that keeps happening over and over again. And it's a choice that we have to keep making, and a journey that we have to keep making. And it is sometimes painful. But this death which is actually a kind of transformation. It brings new life that the Magi had not experienced before. It opens up a life that is somehow more real than their previous lives, more daring, more exciting, more stimulating than the things of the old dispensation. And I think what I want to emphasize about this is that it's simple, but it is okay to feel trepidation on this journey that we're on. It's okay to have complex or even contradictory feelings about following Jesus. It is not all unadulterated joy. The birth and the new life, that implies at the same time a death that keeps happening. And nobody wants to die in that way. And so the message that I'll end with is that I encourage us to keep journeying towards Jesus together. And the together is a very important part of it, because it's easier to feel like aliens together, to remind each other that this is an unending journey, an unending process. And sometimes, in all honesty, it does feel like a really difficult slog through the snow or whatever. But it is the way of transformation. Transformation. Camel transportation. New life and joy.